Imagine standing on the dusty plains of Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago, where the air hums with the energy of something unprecedented, the birth of the world's first empire. This wasn't just another kingdom or city-state. It was a revolution in human organization, a seismic shift in how power could be wielded across vast distances and diverse peoples. The Akkadian Empire didn't just rise, it engineered control with a precision that would inspire empires for millennia. And today, we're going to unravel exactly how they did it. What made Akkad so extraordinary? Picture this: a land where no single ruler had ever held sway over so many cities, so many cultures, so much territory. Before Akkad, Mesopotamia was a patchwork of independent city-states, each with its own gods, laws, and rivalries. But then came Sargon of Akkad, a leader whose ambition and ingenuity shattered those old boundaries. He didn't just conquer, he transformed. He built systems military, bureaucratic, even cultural, that bound distant regions into a cohesive whole. And here's the thing, those systems weren't just about brute force. They were about psychology, about infrastructure, about understanding human nature in ways that still feel eerily modern. This is the story of how Akkad cracked the code of empire building and why its legacy matters to us today. Think about the tools of control we take for granted: standardized weights and measures, centralized administration, even propaganda. Akkad pioneered them all. Their innovations weren't just practical, they were psychological masterstrokes designed to make people believe in the empire's inevitability. And that's what we'll explore together: the clever, sometimes surprising strategies that turned Akkad into history's first superpower. From its awe-inspiring military campaigns to the subtle art of governance, this is a tale of ambition, innovation, and the timeless hunger for power. So let's step back into the ancient world and uncover how Akkad didn't just rise, it rewrote the rules of history. The story of Sargon of Akkad begins like something out of legend, a tale so dramatic it blurs the line between history and myth. Born to a humble gardener, some accounts even claim he was set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates River, echoing later stories like Moses in the Bible. But what's undeniable is his meteoric rise from obscurity to the pinnacle of power. In a world where kingship was often inherited or seized through brute force, Sargon did something radical. He redefined what it meant to rule. Before Akkad, Mesopotamia was a fractured landscape of rival city-states like Uruk, and Lagash, each jealously guarding its independence. These weren't just political entities, they were cultural and religious centers with deeply entrenched identities. To unite them required more than military might. It demanded a visionary who could see beyond tribal loyalties. Sargon's genius lay in his ability to blend conquest with diplomacy. He didn't just crush his enemies, he absorbed them, offering defeated rulers a place in his administration if they pledged loyalty. This wasn't mere mercy, it was strategic brilliance. By keeping local elites in positions of influence, he softened resistance and gave conquered peoples a stake in the empire's success. But let's not romanticize his methods. Sargon's campaigns were relentless. Ancient texts describe entire cities razed, their walls torn down not just to punish but to send a message. Resistance was futile. Yet even in destruction there was calculation. When he dismantled city walls, he often replaced them with garrisons and administrative centers, turning former battlegrounds into hubs of imperial control. And here's where his military strategy gets truly fascinating. He pioneered the use of a standing army. Unlike earlier rulers who relied on temporary militias, Sargon maintained a permanent force, loyal only to him. This wasn't just about power projection. It was about creating a tool that could respond instantly to rebellions or external threats, ensuring stability across vast distances. What's often overlooked, though, is how Sargon weaponized perception. He didn't just conquer land, he conquered minds. Inscriptions from his reign boast of ships from distant lands docking in Akkad's harbors, of exotic goods flowing into the capital. This wasn't just bragging, it was propaganda designed to portray Akkad as the inevitable center of the world. By controlling trade routes and flooding markets with wealth, he made submission seem not just prudent but profitable. And that perhaps was his most enduring innovation, the idea that an empire could be as much an economic and cultural project as a military one. So when we talk about Sargon's military genius, we're really talking about something far broader, a blueprint for empire that would echo through history. From the logistics of supply lines to the psychology of dominance, he didn't just build an empire, he invented the playbook. And as we'll see next, that playbook extended far beyond the battlefield. Sargon didn't just assemble an army, he redefined what an army could be. Before Akkad, warfare in Mesopotamia was a seasonal affair, with farmers picking up weapons when called upon, then returning to their fields. But Sargon's vision demanded something far more formidable, a force available year-round, trained not just to fight but to dominate. These weren't makeshift bands of conscripts, they were full-time soldiers, paid from the empire's coffers and loyal to the crown alone. Imagine the shock this must have caused rival city-states, accustomed to sporadic raids, now facing a relentless professional war machine. The Akkadian military's edge wasn't just in its permanence, it was in its technology. While others still relied on simple copper weapons, Sargon's troops wielded bronze, a harder, more durable alloy that turned spears and axes into instruments of terror. Then there were the composite bows, crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, capable of launching arrows with deadly precision at distances that left enemies defenseless. This wasn't just an upgrade in gear, it was a leap in lethality. But perhaps the most underrated innovation was logistics. Sargon's armies moved with startling speed because they didn't just march. They were supplied by a network of depots and supply trains, ensuring they could strike deep into enemy territory without starving or running out of arrows. Yet weapons and logistics alone didn't secure Akkad's dominance. Sargon mastered the art of psychological conquest. When a city resisted, he didn't just defeat it, he made an example of it. Walls were torn down not merely to prevent future rebellions, but to erase symbols of defiance. Rebellious populations were uprooted en masse, scattered across the empire to break their unity and identity. This wasn't random cruelty, it was calculated theater. By deporting entire communities, Sargon sent a chilling message. Resistance meant annihilation, not just of armies but of ways of life. And it worked. The mere threat of such reprisals often made cities surrender without a fight, trading their independence for survival. But the true stroke of genius. Sargon knew fear alone couldn't sustain an empire. Alongside the stick, he offered a carrot. Conquered elites were integrated into Akkad's administration, their loyalty bought with titles and privileges. Local traditions weren't erased outright, they were absorbed, reframed to serve the empire's narrative. Temples still stood, but now they glorified Akkad's gods alongside local deities. This wasn't just tolerance, it was assimilation by design. A way to make imperial rule feel less like occupation and more like inevitability. What emerges from this isn't just the story of a conqueror, but of a systems thinker. Sargon didn't win battles, he engineered obedience. His innovations, standing armies, superior weaponry, psychological warfare didn't just secure victories on the battlefield. They reshaped the very idea of power, proving that control wasn't just about force but about perception, logistics, and the careful balance of terror and reward. And as we'll see next, these principles didn't stop at the battlefield's edge. They seeped into the streets, the markets, and the daily lives of everyone under Akkad's rule. Conquering territory was only half the battle. Keeping it under control required an entirely different kind of innovation. The Akkadians didn't just rely on armies to hold their empire together. They built something far more enduring, a bureaucratic machine so advanced it would become the model for every great empire that followed. At the heart of this system were the scribes, trained in the intricate art of cuneiform, who turned clay tablets into the empire's memory. Every tax payment, every legal dispute, every shipment of grain was meticulously recorded, creating a paper trail of accountability that stretched from the capital to the farthest provinces. This wasn't just bookkeeping, it was the first real attempt at large-scale governance, a way to make the abstract idea of an empire tangible in the daily lives of its subjects. But records alone couldn't guarantee loyalty. Sargon understood that to prevent rebellion, he needed to reshape the very structure of power. Local rulers who might cling to old allegiances were replaced with hand-picked governors answering directly to him. These weren't just administrators, they were extensions of the emperor's will, tasked with enforcing laws, collecting taxes, and rooting out dissent. And here's the clever part: many of these governors were drawn from conquered elites, offered prestige in exchange for obedience. By giving them a stake in the system, Sargon turned potential rivals into collaborators, weaving their interests into the fabric of the empire. Then came the real stroke of genius: standardization. Imagine a world where every city had its own weights, measures, and even currencies, making trade a chaotic mess of negotiations and disputes. Akkad changed all that. For the first time, a merchant in Susa could trade with a buyer in Nineveh using the same units, the same rules, the same expectations. Standardized weights carved from stone ensured fairness, while uniform accounting practices made commerce flow smoothly across hundreds of miles. This wasn't just about convenience, it was about control. By making the empire's systems indispensable to daily life, Akkad ensured that rebellion wouldn't just mean defying a distant king. It would mean unraveling the very networks that fed and enriched its people. Yet the most subtle form of control might have been cultural. Akkadian became the language of administration, of trade, of power. Local dialects persisted, but to get ahead, to negotiate, to appeal to authority, you needed to speak the empire's tongue. Over time, this created a shared identity, a sense that belonging to Akkad wasn't just about submission, it was about participation. Temples were rebuilt in a unified style, festivals were synchronized, and even myths were adapted to weave local gods into Akkad's cosmic order. The message was clear: resistance wasn't just feudal, it was unnatural. What made this bureaucracy so revolutionary wasn't just its efficiency, it was its adaptability. When drought struck, the system could redistribute grain. When rebellions flared, it could track the flow of weapons. And when new lands were conquered, the same templates of governance could be rolled out like blueprints, turning chaos into order with startling speed. This wasn't just an empire held together by force. It was one engineered to endure, with systems so robust they would outlast even Sargon himself. And as we'll see next, those systems extended far beyond offices and archives. They were etched into the very landscape, in roads, canals, and monuments that shouted Akkad's dominance to the heavens. The Akkadians didn't just build infrastructure, they weaponized it. Every road, every canal, every fortress was a carefully calculated instrument of control, designed to bind the empire together not just physically but psychologically. Take their road network, for example. These weren't mere dirt paths, they were engineered highways wide enough for troops to march in formation and for merchants to move goods with unprecedented speed. By linking distant cities to the capital, these roads did something revolutionary. They shrank the empire. A message that once took weeks to deliver could now race across the land in days, ensuring rebellions were crushed before they could spread. But the roads weren't just for armies. They were economic lifelines, funneling wealth back to Akkad while making outlying regions dependent on imperial trade. Then there were the canals, masterpieces of hydraulic engineering that transformed the political landscape as much as the physical one. In a region where water meant survival, controlling its flow meant controlling lives. The Akkadians didn't just dig ditches, they created vast irrigation systems that turned barren stretches into lush farmland, rewarding loyal regions with prosperity while leaving dissenters parched. A city that resisted might find its water supply diverted overnight, its fields withering under the sun, but those that cooperated, they flourished under Akkad's patronage, their harvests swelling under the careful management of imperial engineers. This wasn't just agriculture, it was a form of soft power, a way to make obedience literally fruitful. Fortresses completed this triad of control. Perched on hillsides or looming over river crossings, these stone sentinels weren't just defensive structures, they were billboards of imperial might. Garrisons stationed inside could respond to unrest within hours, their presence a constant reminder that resistance was futile, but their design reveals even deeper cunning. Many fortresses doubled as administrative centers where taxes were collected and laws enforced, blending military might with bureaucratic efficiency. A farmer paying his grain tax at the fortress gates wasn't just fulfilling an obligation, he was acknowledging Akkad's dominance in the most visceral way possible. Yet for all their brilliance, these physical systems had limits. Roads could be sabotaged, canals silted up, fortresses besieged. The real glue holding the empire together was something less tangible but far more enduring: culture. Beyond the stone and mortar, Akkad's rulers understood that to last, their empire needed to live in the hearts and minds of its people, and that's where their most subtle and perhaps most effective tools of control came into play. Language was Akkad's silent weapon, one that reshaped identities without a single battle. While armies could enforce obedience, Sargon knew true control required something deeper, making people think, trade, and even pray in ways that bound them to the empire. Akkadian didn't replace local tongues, it layered over them, becoming the language of power, commerce, and prestige. Imagine a merchant in Kish haggling over prices in Sumerian, then switching to Akkadian to sign a contract with imperial officials. Over generations, this linguistic dance eroded old loyalties, making Akkadian the key to advancement. Even scribes trained in cuneiform found themselves adapting ancient Sumerian texts into Akkadian, subtly rewriting history itself to center the empire. Religion became another carefully curated tool. Instead of smashing local temples, Akkad's rulers expanded them, adding shrines to their own gods alongside native deities. In Nippur, the Sumerian god Enlil still reigned supreme, but now he shared his temple with Akkad's patron deity, Ishtar. This wasn't mere coexistence, it was theological fusion, a way to imply that Akkad's rule was divinely ordained. Festivals once celebrating city-specific harvests were recalibrated to honor imperial victories, weaving Akkad's triumphs into the sacred calendar. Over time, these shared rituals created a collective memory, making resistance feel not just dangerous but blasphemous. Art and architecture broadcasted the same message. Statues of Sargon and his successors weren't just political symbols, they were visual propaganda, placed in city squares where daily life revolved around them. Steles depicting Akkadian victories stood at crossroads, their carvings showing conquered rulers bowing not in chains but in apparent willingness, reinforcing the myth of benevolent domination. Even cylinder seals used to stamp clay tablets began featuring standardized imperial motifs, turning every bureaucratic transaction into a tiny act of cultural assimilation. Yet the most enduring legacy might be how Akkad reframed identity itself. Local elites who adopted Akkadian dress, names, and customs found doors opening in the imperial court. Those who resisted became relics, gradually sidelined by a system that rewarded conformity. This cultural alchemy, part coercion, part opportunity, transformed subjects into stakeholders. And it worked so well that centuries after Akkad's fall, its language and traditions persisted, layered into the DNA of later empires like Babylon and Assyria. Now consider trade, the empire's velvet-gloved fist. Akkad didn't just control land, it monopolized the flow of wealth, turning commerce into another strand of its web. By standardizing weights and establishing protected trade routes, the empire made itself indispensable. A merchant in Elam could trade silver for Anatolian copper with confidence, knowing Akkadian garrisons kept bandits at bay, but that security came at a price. Taxes flowed back to the capital, and with them, intelligence. Every caravan carried more than goods. It carried information, allowing the empire to monitor dissent and adjust its grip. This wasn't just an economy, it was a feedback loop of control where prosperity and surveillance walked hand in hand. Trade routes were the arteries of Akkad's empire, pulsing with goods that turned geography into power. Picture caravans lumbering across deserts with silver from Anatolia, ships docking at Persian Gulf ports laden with timber from Lebanon, and donkeys straining under loads of copper from Oman. These weren't just commercial exchanges, they were threads in a vast web of dependency. By controlling access to essential resources, Akkad didn't just profit, it dictated survival. Cities that once thrived on local trade suddenly found themselves unable to build, arm, or even feed their people without imperial approval. A rebellion might mean the sudden disappearance of bronze for tools or cedar for roofs, leaving populations shivering and defenseless. The genius lay in the system's flexibility. Akkad didn't just blockade enemies, it manipulated prices. Loyal regions enjoyed favorable rates for grain shipments, while resistant cities faced exorbitant tariffs that drained their treasuries. Tax collectors didn't merely demand tribute, they enforced economic loyalty, taking percentages not just in silver but in the very goods that fueled local industries. A textile center like might surrender bolts of fine linen instead of coin, tying its prosperity directly to imperial whims. And here's the twist, many of these taxes were reinvested locally, funding roads or garrisons that further cemented Akkad's presence. Communities paid for their own subjugation, mistaking infrastructure for generosity. Yet the real mastery was in the empire's monopoly over prestige. Luxury items like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan or carved obsidian from Egypt didn't just signify wealth, they became status symbols tied to imperial favor. Local elites who displayed Akkadian-style jewelry or hosted feasts with imported wines weren't just showing off, they were performing allegiance. The message was clear, opulence flowed through the empire's hands, and those who resisted would be left with drab obscurity. But no system is invincible. The same wealth that fueled Akkad's dominance also painted a target on its back. Raiders from the Zagros Mountains eyed plump caravans, while rival kingdoms resented their exclusion from lucrative routes. Even within the empire, resentment simmered. Regions rich in resources but denied fair compensation, like the copper-heavy lands of Dilmun, began questioning why they should feed a distant capital's glory. And when drought struck, as it periodically did, the fragile balance collapsed. Starving provinces watched as imperial granaries remained full, their shipments prioritized to loyal zones. Famine became political, hunger a revolt waiting to spark. Akkad's economy was a masterpiece of control, but like all empires, it learned the hard way that prosperity has a tipping point. The very mechanisms that bound regions to the center, dependency, inequality, coercion, eventually bred the forces that would tear it apart. And as we'll see next, those forces didn't just emerge from the outside. They festered in the empire's blind spots, nurtured by the arrogance of unchallenged power. Even the most meticulously engineered systems have cracks, and Akkad's empire was no exception. For all its bureaucratic sophistication and military might, the reality of ruling such a vast territory meant facing constant challenges from within. Cities that had once been proud, independent powers now chafed under Akkadian taxes and garrisons. The very elite Sargon had co-opted with titles and privileges began questioning their bargain as imperial demands grew heavier. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, waiting for moments of weakness to erupt into open rebellion. Take the case of Sumer, the fertile southern region where Akkad's rule was always most fragile. Here, ancient city-states like and Lagash had traditions stretching back centuries before Sargon's rise. Their priests and merchants remembered a time when their gods, not Akkad's, dominated temple rituals. When drought struck or taxes bit too deeply, these memories flared into resistance. One clay tablet from the period describes a revolt in Lagash so fierce that Akkadian officials barricaded themselves in the governor's compound while fires raged through the streets. This wasn't just disobedience, it was a cultural reckoning, a rejection of the empire's claim to legitimacy. Sargon's successors responded with escalating brutality. His grandson, Naram faced so many rebellions that he reshaped imperial policy entirely. Where Sargon had blended diplomacy with force, Naram relied on terror. Entire cities were emptied, their populations marched hundreds of miles to unfamiliar lands where they couldn't organize resistance. Key families were forced to send children to the capital as hostages, their safety contingent on good behavior. And when outright revolt occurred, the punishment was apocalyptic. Texts boast of cities leveled, their fields salted, their temples defiled. The message was clear: defiance meant erasure. Yet these tactics carried a fatal flaw. Every mass deportation, every razed temple, every public execution created fresh enemies. Uprooted populations carried their grievances across the empire, spreading dissent like seeds on the wind. Hostage-taking bred resentment even among loyalists, who watched their children grow up as strangers in Akkad's courts. And the economic toll was staggering. Burning productive farmland or depopulating craft centers meant less wealth to fund the very armies enforcing order. The empire began consuming itself, its short-term victories undermining long-term stability. What's striking is how these internal fractures mirrored the empire's original strengths. The same roads that sped troops to rebellions also helped rebels coordinate. The standardized weights that facilitated trade made it easier for dissidents to hoard resources. Even Akkadian language, once a tool of unity, became a double-edged sword. Rebel manifestos now circulated in the empire's own tongue, rallying discontents from Susa to the Persian Gulf. The systems designed to bind the empire together were being turned against it, and then came the outsiders. While Akkad's rulers focused on internal threats, new dangers gathered at the edges. Nomadic tribes watching the empire's self-inflicted wounds, rival kingdoms testing its weakened borders. The empire that had once seemed invincible now faced crises on all fronts, its grip slipping not from a single catastrophic defeat but from 1,000 cuts, both within and beyond its control. The story of Akkad's fall isn't just about armies clashing. It's about the unraveling of an idea, the moment when the cost of control finally outweighed its rewards. Akkad's borders were never truly secure, not because its armies were weak, but because its wealth was irresistible. From the rugged Zagros mountains came the Gutians, tribes hardened by harsh terrain and hunger. These weren't disorganized raiders, they were opportunistic strategists who studied Akkad's rhythms, waiting for moments when rebellions or droughts stretched imperial forces thin. Ancient tablets describe their tactics, lightning-fast strikes on undefended caravans, then vanishing into mountain passes before reinforcements arrived. At first, these were just pinpricks annoyances Akkad could absorb. But as internal crises multiplied, the pinpricks became gashes, bleeding the empire of resources and morale. The Gutians' most devastating weapon wasn't their swords, it was timing. When Akkad's bureaucrats struggled to quell uprisings in Sumer, the mountain warriors struck northern supply depots, severing food shipments to the capital. When droughts forced the empire to ration grain, they ambushed relief convoys, turning scarcity into famine. Akkad responded with characteristic ingenuity, building fortified outposts along trade routes and launching punitive expeditions into Gutian territory. But here's the cruel irony: every fort drained manpower from other fronts, and every campaign into the mountains cost more than it gained. The empire was playing whack-aim all across a 1,000-mile frontier, exhausting itself to protect a periphery it couldn't fully control. Meanwhile, other predators circled. In Elam, ambitious kings watched Akkad's struggles, remembering when their own cities had bowed to Sargon's heirs. Now they tested the waters first with border skirmishes, then with outright invasions. The difference: Elam wasn't some nomadic nuisance. It was a sophisticated rival with its own bureaucracy, its own professional army. Battles here weren't hit-and-run affairs but grinding wars of attrition, where Akkad's once unstoppable legions found themselves bogged down in sieges that dragged on for years. Yet the deadliest threat wasn't human at all. Archaeology reveals a chilling pattern: layers of silt in Akkadian cities, evidence of catastrophic flooding, followed by layers of wind-blown dust, the mark of prolonged drought. The empire's heartland depended on the twin rivers, but climate had begun to betray it. Crops failed, canals ran dry, and starving refugees flooded into cities already strained by war. Tablets from this period speak of grain prices soaring 50-fold, of temples overwhelmed by beggars, of officials desperately rerouting water to politically vital regions while others withered. Akkad's greatest engineering triumphs, its canals, its granaries, were now lifelines stretched to breaking. This wasn't just bad weather, it was a cascade of disasters. Droughts forced pastoralists like the Gutians to raid more aggressively. Failed harvests meant fewer taxes to fund armies, and as hunger spread, so did unrest, not just in conquered territories but in Akkad's core cities, where citizens began asking why their gods had abandoned them. The empire's decline wasn't a single event but a symphony of collapse, where military overreach, environmental shocks, and bureaucratic exhaustion played in grim harmony. What makes this unraveling so haunting is how modern it feels. Akkad didn't fall because its people forgot how to govern or fight. It fell because the systems designed to sustain it, centralized control, intensive agriculture, resource extraction, became vulnerabilities when pushed beyond their limits. The very innovations that built history's first empire ultimately sowed the seeds of its demise, a lesson etched not in battle chronicles but in layers of dust and clay. The unraveling of Akkad wasn't marked by a single cataclysmic event. It was death by 1,000 cuts, with nature itself wielding the sharpest blade. Tree rings and sediment cores from ancient Mesopotamia tell a chilling story. Around 4,200 years ago, the region was gripped by a mega-drought so severe it lasted for generations. Rivers that had nourished civilizations shrank to trickles, and the once fertile crescent turned to dust. For an empire built on the promise of abundance, this wasn't just a crisis, it was an existential threat. Imagine the panic as Akkadian officials watched their grand canals, engineering marvels designed to defy nature, slowly choke with silt. Without regular floods to flush them clean, these lifelines became stagnant ditches, leaving fields parched and harvests withered. The bureaucratic machine, so adept at moving grain from surplus regions to hungry ones, now faced empty storehouses. Tablet after tablet from this period pleads for relief. There is no food in the city, one scribe scrawls in desperation. Another records the unthinkable parents selling their children for a handful of barley. The social contract that bound the empire together was crumbling faster than its mud brick walls. But the drought's true devastation lay in how it amplified every flaw in Akkad's design. As crops failed, taxes dried up, leaving garrisons unpaid and restless. Trade routes withered without goods to move, strangling the flow of silver that greased the imperial machinery. And here's the cruel twist: Akkad's very success made its collapse more catastrophic. By centralizing power and resources, the empire had created a system where failure in one place meant disaster everywhere. A bad harvest in Sumer no longer just meant local hunger, it triggered chain reactions that starved cities hundreds of miles away. The psychological toll was even worse. Mesopotamians believed their kings ruled by divine mandate, their prosperity proof of heavenly favor. So when famine came, it wasn't just stomachs that emptied, it was faith. Temples overflowed with desperate offerings, but the gods stayed silent. Naram Sin, Akkad's once mighty ruler, took the unprecedented step of sacking the sacred city of Nippur, looting Enlil's temple in a bid to replenish his coffers. This wasn't just sacrilege, it was an admission that the empire's spiritual legitimacy had evaporated. Yet the most haunting lesson lies in how Akkad's end reshaped Mesopotamia's future. When the empire finally fractured, it didn't dissolve into chaos. It shattered into smaller, more resilient pieces. City-states like and Isin rose from the ashes, but they'd learned from Akkad's mistakes. Their canals were smaller, easier to maintain. Their granaries were decentralized, buffering against regional failures. Even their gods were humbler, no longer tied to the hubris of eternal empire. This wasn't regression, it was adaptation, a hard one, understanding that survival meant working with nature, not conquering it. The Gutians, often blamed for delivering the killing blow, were really just scavengers picking at a corpse. By the time their warriors breached Akkad's gates, the empire was already a shell, its fields barren, its people scattered, its once glorious capital choking on dust. What followed wasn't darkness, though, but reinvention. The technologies Akkad had pioneered, standardized weights, bureaucratic record-keeping, even its language, lived on, stripped of their imperial arrogance and repurposed by survivors. In the end, Akkad's greatest legacy wasn't its rise or fall, but the indelible mark it left on humanity's playbook of power. Every empire that followed, from Babylon to Rome, would wrestle with the same question: how to build something mighty enough to dominate, yet flexible enough to endure when the rains stop and the earth rebels. 200 years, that's all it took for history's first empire to crumble from world-shaking power to scattered ruins. The Gutians stormed through Akkad's weakened defenses, but their invasion was less a cause of collapse than a symptom. Like a tree hollowed out by termites, the empire had been rotting from within long before the first mountain warrior breached its gates. Without strong leadership to hold its vast bureaucracy together, the system that once bound distant provinces into a cohesive whole began unraveling. Tax collectors stopped coming, grain shipments ceased, The roads that had pulsed with imperial messengers fell silent, reclaimed by dust and weeds. Yet here's the paradox: Akkad's physical empire died, but its ideas proved immortal. Future rulers studied its ruins like blueprints. Babylon's Hammurabi didn't just conquer, he codified laws in Akkadian cuneiform, borrowing the empire's administrative language along with its tactics. Assyrian kings replicated Sargon's deportation strategies, scattering rebellious populations with chilling precision. Even Persia's Cyrus, centuries later, would echo Akkad's playbook: centralized rule, standardized weights, a network of royal roads, but with one crucial difference: he learned from its mistakes. Where Akkad had relied on fear, Persia tempered power with cultural tolerance. Where Akkad's bureaucracy grew rigid, Persia's adapted. What truly set Akkad apart wasn't just its innovations, but their raw, untested audacity. Think of it as humanity's first draft of empire, revolutionary yet flawed, groundbreaking yet brittle. The Egyptians built pyramids, but Akkad built systems. The Sumerians wrote poetry, but Akkad wrote tax codes. Its genius lay in recognizing that control wasn't just about monuments or battles, but about shaping daily reality through administration, infrastructure, and psychology. Compare this to other ancient superpowers. The Indus Valley civilization flourished through decentralized harmony, its cities remarkably uniform yet lacking clear central authority. The early Chinese dynasties ruled through ritual and celestial mandate, their power more cultural than bureaucratic. Akkad was different. It sought to quantify, to standardize, to mechanize governance itself. In doing so, it revealed both the potential and peril of engineered control, systems powerful enough to unite a region, yet fragile enough to shatter when pushed beyond their limits. The lesson resonates across millennia. Every empire since has wrestled with Akkad's core dilemma: how to balance centralization with flexibility, authority with adaptation. Rome's roads and aqueducts mirrored Akkad's canals and highways, but its citizenship model offered something Akkad never did: a stake in the system for conquered peoples. The British Empire's global trade networks recalled Akkad's monopolies, but industrial technology allowed control at distances Sargon couldn't fathom. Akkad's true legacy lies in this uncomfortable truth: no empire lasts forever, but the tools of dominance evolve. What began with clay tablets and bronze spears now lives on in algorithms and supply chains. The methods grow more sophisticated, the scale more vast, yet the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. How much control is too much? How much centralization before the system snaps? 4,000 years later, we're still searching for answers, still walking paths first paved by history's earliest imperial architects. Akkad stands apart from other ancient superpowers not just in age, but in design. Where Egypt's pharaohs ruled behind the natural fortresses of deserts and cataracts, Akkad's heartland lay exposed on open plains, vulnerable from every direction. The Indus Valley cities thrived through loose cultural connections, their identical brickwork suggesting shared ideas rather than centralized rule. But Akkad, it was empire as conscious invention, a patchwork of conquered territories stitched together not by geography or tradition, but by sheer organizational will. Consider the contrast with Egypt's Old Kingdom. For centuries, the Nile's predictable floods allowed pharaohs to project power through monument building rather than constant military campaigns. Pyramids weren't just tombs, they were physical manifestations of stability, proof that the gods favored an unchanging order. Akkad had no such luxury. Without natural barriers or divine certainty, its rulers turned to innovation, standing armies instead of seasonal levies, clay tablets tracking taxes rather than stone carvings celebrating eternity. Where Egypt's power flowed from ritual, Akkad sprang from receipts. the Indus Valley presents an even starker difference. Excavations at Mohenjo-Daro reveal a civilization with standardized weights and city grids, yet no evidence of palaces, temples, or even clear rulers. Power seems to have been distributed, decisions made collectively. Akkad inverted this model entirely. Every cuneiform tablet, every garrison placement, every standardized measure reinforced one truth: authority radiated from the center outward. This wasn't just governance, it was control engineered to compensate for the lack of natural advantages. Yet this very ingenuity carried the seeds of vulnerability. Egypt could retreat behind its deserts when crisis came. The Indus cities could adapt locally when trade networks frayed. Akkad's systems, though brilliant, created dependencies. Cut off a provincial capital from the bureaucratic machine, and its grain stores might sit locked while people starved, awaiting orders from distant scribes. The empire's strength, its ability to micromanage, became its Achilles heel when droughts hit or couriers couldn't get through. Later empires learned from this precarious balance. The Assyrians kept Akkad's military professionalism but added layered defenses, fortress cities within fortress regions. The Persians adopted its administrative systems but allowed local customs to flourish, reducing the friction of rule. Even Rome, millennia later, would grapple with the same questions Akkad first posed. How much centralization is too much? When does efficiency become brittleness? What makes Akkad's experiment so compelling is its naked ambition. This wasn't empire as an organic growth, but as a calculated gamble, one that rewrote the rules of power only to reveal their limits. The very innovations that let it punch above its weight also made it exquisitely sensitive to disruption, a lesson every superpower since has had to confront in its own way. Akkad's legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power without consent is a ticking clock. The empire's founders built a machine of unprecedented control, standing armies, standardized trade, bureaucratic oversight, but its gears were greased with fear. When drought or rebellion jammed those gears, the whole system seized up. Compare this to later empires that lasted centuries, not decades. The Assyrians, for example, copied Akkad's military playbook but paired it with psychological manipulation, deporting elites to break resistance while offering incentives to collaborators. Even more telling is Persia's approach under Cyrus the Great. Where Akkad's rulers demanded cultural assimilation, Cyrus issued the Cyrus cylinder, guaranteeing subjects the right to worship their own gods, a stroke of genius that turned potential rebels into stakeholders. The difference lies in elasticity. Akkad's systems were rigid, designed to enforce compliance rather than adapt to change. Its tax quotas didn't adjust for poor harvests. Its garrisons couldn't shift focus from external threats to internal unrest fast enough. Later empires solved this by building slack into their systems. Rome's client kingdoms, for instance, enjoyed local autonomy as long as they paid taxes and supplied troops. This wasn't weakness, it was resilience, a way to absorb shocks without fracturing. Modern parallels are everywhere. Corporations once modeled on strict hierarchies now embrace decentralized teams. Governments that relied on top-down mandates increasingly delegate power to municipalities. The lesson is clear: control that demands total submission might achieve short-term dominance, but lasting power requires breathing room. Akkad's greatest failure wasn't its ambition. It was its inability to imagine a world where subjects could be partners rather than prisoners. Yet for all its flaws, Akkad's influence echoes through history. Babylon's law codes borrowed its administrative precision. The Mongols replicated its rapid communication networks. Even today, the tension between centralization and local autonomy plays out in everything from federal governments to tech platforms. The next time you see a debate over states' rights or corporate decentralization, remember, you're watching the latest chapter in a story Akkad wrote 4,000 years ago. The rediscovery of Akkad wasn't the work of a single dramatic excavation. It was a slow unraveling of clues scattered across millennia. For centuries, the empire existed only in cryptic references, a ghost haunting Mesopotamian tablets that later scribes copied and recopied. Then, in the late 19th century, archaeologists began piecing together fragments of a puzzle no one knew was complete. At Tel Brak in modern Syria, they uncovered a sprawling palace complex with walls 3 meters thick, too massive for a mere city-state. Nearby, cylinder seals bore the inscriptions of Sargon's officials, their Akkadian script still crisp after 4,000 years. Each discovery was like lifting a veil, revealing an empire that had once been the stuff of legend. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source: looted artifacts. In the 1870s, antiquities dealers flooded European markets with cuneiform tablets of unknown origin. Scholars initially dismissed them as fakes until one sharp-eyed linguist noticed recurring names: Sargon, Rimush, Naram, Sin, names that matched those of Akkadian kings from later Babylonian king lists. Suddenly, these weren't just random relics, they were pages from a lost imperial archive. Among them was the famous Sargon legend, a text describing the ruler's rise from obscurity, confirming that the stories weren't just myth but rooted in historical memory. Modern archaeology has added even richer layers to this picture. Satellite imagery reveals long-buried road networks radiating from Akkadian sites, some stretching over 200 kilometers, their straight lines betraying imperial engineering rather than organic growth. Soil cores from ancient fields show abrupt shifts in crop patterns, evidence of centralized agricultural planning. Even skeletal remains tell a story. Isotope analysis of bones from this period shows sudden changes in diet, with populations hundreds of miles apart consuming remarkably similar foods, a silent testament to Akkad's far-reaching trade networks. Yet the most poignant finds are the smallest. In the ruins of a scribble school at Nippur, archaeologists unearthed practice tablets where students copied Akkadian proverbs alongside math exercises. One clumsy attempt reads, "The strong must not oppress the weak," a line from Hammurabi's later law code, proving that Akkad's ideals outlasted its collapse. Nearby, a child's toy chariot was found, its wheels still turning after millennia, a humble reminder that empires aren't just built on battlefields, but in the daily lives of people who called them home. What makes these discoveries so electrifying isn't just their age, it's their intimacy. Every broken seal, every ration list, every worn step in a garrison stairway whispers the same truth: Akkad wasn't an abstract power. It was lived reality, a web of decisions and compromises that shaped countless ordinary lives. And as we piece together these fragments, we're not just reconstructing an empire, we're recovering the echoes of humanity's first attempt to engineer destiny on a continental scale. Rediscovering Akkad was like watching a phantom slowly take shape, a civilization emerging from the shadows of myth into the light of history. 19th century archaeologists didn't just dig up ruins, they resurrected an entire worldview. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered in Nineveh's library but echoing Akkadian themes. Here was proof that the empire's stories outlived its collapse, passed down through generations like a cultural heartbeat. Then came the administrative tablets, thousands of them, detailing everything from grain shipments to worker rations. These weren't dry records, they were the empire's central nervous system, revealing how Akkad turned chaos into order with bureaucratic precision. But the real game-changer was Sargon's own voice. Inscriptions found at Nippur and Susa boasted of his conquests, but read between the lines and you catch glimpses of imperial psychology. One stele shows him towering over bound enemies, not just as a warrior but as a unifier, the first ruler to frame conquest as destiny rather than mere plunder. Even his title, King of the Four Quarters, was a masterstroke claiming dominion not just over lands but over the very cardinal directions, as if the universe itself bowed to Akkad. Yet for every answer archaeology provides, a dozen mysteries linger. The location of Akkad's capital remains lost, possibly buried beneath modern Baghdad's sprawl. Scattered tablets hint at a devastating curse of Akkad, a celestial wrath that doomed the empire. But was this propaganda, climate change, or something darker? And then there's the puzzle of the Gutians. Were they truly the barbarian horde later texts describe, or victims of Akkadian smear campaigns? Technology is rewriting these questions. LiDAR scans now trace the empire's forgotten road networks beneath Iraqi deserts, while isotope analysis of pottery reveals trade routes stretching from Oman to Anatolia. Even the humble cylinder seal, once used to stamp clay tablets, tells a story. Archaeologists found identical seals in cities hundreds of miles apart, proof of a standardized bureaucracy that functioned like an ancient blockchain, tamper-proof and empire-wide. What makes Akkad's rediscovery so thrilling isn't just filling gaps in a history book. It's watching humanity's first experiment with large-scale governance come back to life, one shattered tablet at a time. And as new excavations begin in war-torn regions like northern Syria, who knows what other secrets still lie buried, waiting to reshape our understanding of power's oldest playbook. The vanished capital of Akkad remains one of history's most tantalizing puzzles. Unlike the towering ziggurats of Ur or the sprawling ruins of Babylon, Akkad's heart has eluded discovery, its exact location debated for over a century. Some scholars believe it lies beneath modern Baghdad, buried under layers of silt and centuries of rebuilding. Others point to clues in ancient texts, references to its position, where the Tigris and Euphrates draw closest, or its legendary docks bustling with ships from distant lands. Yet despite satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, Akkad refuses to reveal itself. This isn't just a missing city, it's a gap in our understanding of how empires centralize power, how they project their grandeur. Without Akkad, we're left to imagine its streets through second-hand accounts, palaces lined with lapis lazuli, temples where priests tracked the movements of stars, markets humming with languages from across the known world. Equally puzzling is the absence of royal tombs. In Egypt, pharaohs built pyramids as eternal homes. In Ur, Sumerian kings were buried with golden treasures. But Akkad's rulers left no such monuments, or if they did, they vanished without a trace. Some speculate their graves were plundered in antiquity, their treasures melted down or scattered. Others suggest a deliberate act of humility, kings who rejected the cult of death in favor of legacy through living systems. The irony is palpable. An empire that meticulously recorded grain shipments left no blueprint for its own eternity. Then there's the mystery of Akkadian science. Clay tablets from the period contain star charts so precise they track Venus's movements with near-modern accuracy. One fragment describes lunar eclipses decades in advance, suggesting observations passed down through generations. Were these just practical tools for agriculture and religious festivals, or did Akkad scholars glimpse deeper cosmic patterns? Later Babylonian astronomers, often credited with founding astrology, may have built on knowledge lost when Akkad fell. The idea tantalizes that Akkad's greatest innovations might linger not in its ruins but in the stars themselves. These gaps in the record aren't just academic curiosities, they're reminders of how fragile history can be, A single fire, a change in river courses, or a shift in political priorities can erase centuries of achievement. Yet every broken seal or half-decoded tablet reshapes the story. When archaeologists recently uncovered a warehouse of Akkadian tablets in northern Iraq, their mundane lists of shoe repairs and beer rations revealed something extraordinary: the texture of daily life in an empire we'd only known through its wars. What makes Akkad's enigmas so compelling is how they mirror our own times. We live in an age of digital empires, of systems that shape lives invisibly. Like Akkad's bureaucrats, we track and quantify, building structures whose full impact may only be understood centuries from now. The difference is that Akkad's legacy, fragmented as it is, offers us something rare: a chance to study the birth of imperial logic, to see both its brilliance and its brittleness. In its unfinished story, we find warnings and wonders alike, proof that even the mightiest systems are human creations, subject to the same forces they sought to master. Akkad's fingerprints are everywhere in modern governance, not as ancient relics, but as living blueprints. Take propaganda, for instance. The empire didn't just carve victory steels to glorify its kings. It weaponized narrative, flooding conquered cities with tales of its inevitability. Sound familiar? Today's state media and social media algorithms operate on the same principle: control the story, and you control perception. When Akkadian scribes rewrote local myths to include their gods, they were doing what modern nations do when they shape textbooks or fund cultural exchanges: soft power wrapped in tradition. Then there's infrastructure, Akkad's greatest leverage. Those roads and canals weren't just practical, they were political. By making distant regions dependent on centralized systems for water and trade, the empire ensured rebellion meant self-sabotage. Fast forward to the 21st century, and you'll see the same logic in pipelines, fiber optic networks, and even GPS satellites. Modern superpowers don't just build highways, they build dependencies, tying global commerce to their own standards. When Akkad standardized weights and measures, it was the Bronze Age equivalent of a dominant currency or internet protocol tools that seem neutral until they're wielded as leverage. But the most haunting parallel is overextension. Akkad's collapse wasn't triggered by a single enemy. It was death by 1,000 cuts, rebellions, droughts, and bureaucratic bloat. Historians like Dr. Amanda Podany compare it to modern empires straining under unsustainable commitments. The Soviet Union's collapse, America's military quagmires, even the European Union's struggles to balance unity with local autonomy, all echo Akkad's fatal flaw: systems so tightly coupled that one failure cascades. The empire's reliance on grain shipments from rebellious provinces feels eerily similar to modern supply chain crises, where a single blockage can trigger global shortages. Experts point to Akkad's legacy in subtler ways too. Dr. Zainab Barani, an archaeologist at Columbia University, notes how the empire's deportation tactics uprooting populations to break resistance resurface in modern demographic engineering, from colonial resettlements to strategic urbanization. Even its economic controls find echoes in sanctions regimes where trade becomes a chokehold rather than a lifeline. Yet Akkad's true lesson isn't about tactics, it's about fragility. The empire's genius was also its vulnerability, a reminder that no system, no matter how brilliantly designed, is immune to entropy. Modern governments might have drones instead of composite bows, AI instead of clay tablets, but they're still wrestling with the same question Akkad faced: how to balance control with resilience. As we hear from scholars in the next segment, that tension isn't just historical, it's the defining challenge of power itself. Debating Akkad's legacy is like peeling an onion. Every layer reveals new contradictions. Historians remain sharply divided over Sargon's true nature. Was he a ruthless tyrant crushing cities beneath his sandals, or a pragmatic visionary who united warring states for the greater good? Texts from his reign boast of leveled cities and mass deportations, but they also speak of integrating conquered elites into his administration, suggesting a leader who understood the limits of pure force. Dr. Sarah Melville, a leading Assyriologist, argues that Sargon's genius lay in his flexibility. He ruled with an iron fist when necessary, but knew when to offer olive branches. Others, like Professor Mark van der Meerup, counter that his empire was built on systemic violence, a precursor to later authoritarian regimes. Archaeological evidence fuels even fiercer clashes. The ruins of Tel Leilan in northern Syria reveal a sudden abandonment around 2200 BC, a smoking gun for Akkad's collapse, according to some. Soil samples show a dramatic shift to arid conditions, supporting the climate disaster theory, but dig deeper and the picture blurs. At the same site, archaeologists found evidence of continued occupation by a smaller population, hinting that Akkad's fall might have been a slow unraveling rather than a single catastrophic event. Meanwhile, in southern Mesopotamia, tablets from describe rebellions and food shortages, but also moments of surprising resilience, like local officials creatively rerouting water supplies when imperial systems failed. The most heated debates swirl around inevitability. Was Akkad doomed from the start by its own rigid systems, or did it simply fall victim to a perfect storm of droughts, invasions, and bad luck? Dr. Peter Steinkeller points to the empire's over-centralization, its dependence on a single capital and a top-heavy bureaucracy. When Akkad faltered, the entire network seized up. Yet Dr. Augusta McMahon offers a counter-narrative. Akkad's real weakness wasn't its design, but its inability to adapt when climate shifts exceeded its engineering prowess. The empire's canals could handle typical droughts, but not mega-droughts lasting generations. These academic battles aren't just ivory tower squabbles. They shape how we understand power itself. Every fresh excavation or deciphered tablet forces us to reconsider whether Akkad was a cautionary tale or a tragic masterpiece. And that intellectual friction has spilled beyond scholarly journals into something unexpected: popular culture. From video games casting Sargon as a charismatic antihero to novels reimagining Akkad's fall as cosmic allegory, the empire's ambiguity makes it irresistible storytelling fuel. Its ruins aren't just buried under desert sands, they're embedded in our collective imagination, inviting us to project our own fears and fantasies onto history's first grand experiment in control. Akkad's shadow stretches far beyond dusty tablets and forgotten ruins. It lives on in the glow of computer screens and the pages of bestsellers. The empire's blend of raw ambition and enigmatic collapse has made it catnip for storytellers, from blockbuster video games casting Sargon as a brooding antihero to fantasy novels reimagining Akkad as a city of sorcerers and cosmic intrigue. In the Assassin's Creed franchise, Akkad becomes a labyrinth of secret societies, its ziggurats hiding ancient technologies. Meanwhile, historical fiction like The Dragon of Mesopotamia paints Naram Sin as a tragic figure cursed by gods for his hubris. These tales capture the empire's grandeur but often miss its subtleties, turning complex systems of control into simplistic battles of good versus evil. The allure is understandable. What's more dramatic than an empire that rose from nothing to dominate the known world, only to crumble under its own weight? Yet pop culture's obsession with Akkad's spectacle often glosses over its true innovation, the mundane machinery of power. You won't find many games where the hero spends hours auditing clay tax records, though that's where the real story unfolds. The empire's genius wasn't just in its conquests but in its receipts. its road maintenance logs, its meticulously calculated rations for garrison troops. These unglamorous details built the scaffolding of history's first superpower. Some creators, though, dig deeper. The strategy game Old World lets players grapple with Akkad's central dilemma, balancing central authority with regional autonomy. Make your bureaucracy too rigid and provinces revolt, too loose and the empire fractures. It's a surprisingly accurate reflection of the real tensions that plagued Sargon's successors. Even Hollywood has moments of clarity. The TV series Dominion portrays Akkadian propaganda not with fiery speeches but with quiet scenes of scribes rewriting local myths, a nod to the empire's psychological warfare. Yet for all its fictionalized forms, Akkad's most enduring legacy lies in the questions it forces us to confront. How much control is too much? Can prosperity justify oppression? What happens when systems designed for stability become cages? These aren't just ancient debates, they're mirrored in every modern discussion about surveillance states, corporate monopolies, or even social media algorithms. The empire's rise and fall offer a 4,000-year-old case study in the double-edged nature of power, its capacity to build and to blind, to unite and to unravel. As we close this exploration, remember, Akkad wasn't just a place or a period. It was humanity's first draft of empire, written in clay and blood. Its mistakes and triumphs echo wherever people try to govern at scale, reminding us that the tools of control are never neutral. They reflect the values and blind spots of those who wield them. So the next time you see a gleaming skyscraper or a sprawling data center, think of Akkad's vanished towers and ask yourself what future archaeologists might make of our own ambitions. The past never really dies, it just waits for us to listen. Akkad's rise wasn't just luck, it was a masterclass in turning obstacles into advantages. Picture a world where most rulers saw conquered cities as prizes to loot, but Sargon saw them as pieces of a puzzle. His real innovation, harnessing diversity instead of crushing it. When he absorbed Sumerian city-states, he didn't erase their identities, he repurposed them. Sumerian scribes kept their jobs but now wrote in Akkadian. Local gods were worshipped alongside imperial deities. This wasn't tolerance, it was strategy, a way to make empire feel less like occupation and more like evolution. Compare that to modern megacorporations acquiring startups. The smartest don't gut them but preserve their culture while aligning their goals with the parent company's vision. Yet adaptability alone couldn't sustain Akkad. The empire's fatal flaw was its refusal to recognize limits. Naram Sin, Sargon's grandson, didn't just expand the empire, he declared himself a god, chiseling his divine status into stone steels. That unchecked ambition blinded him to looming threats, droughts, rebellions, and nomadic incursions. It's a pattern we've seen repeated from Rome to the British Empire, overreach disguised as destiny. Today's tech titans and superpowers flirt with the same danger, mistaking growth for immortality until supply chains snap or public sentiment shifts. The most striking parallel lies in Akkad's bureaucratic invention systems so effective they outlived the empire itself. Standardized weights and measures, centralized record-keeping, even the concept of a professional civil service. These weren't just tools of control but the DNA of modern governance. When you file taxes or check a global shipping tracker, you're using Akkad's playbook. But here's the catch, those systems became brittle when stretched too thin. The empire's reliance on grain shipments from rebellious provinces mirrors modern, just-in-time supply networks efficient until a single bottleneck triggers collapse. What makes Akkad's story so urgent isn't just its echoes in boardrooms or capitals, it's the warning etched between the lines. The empire thrived by solving problems no one else dared to tackle. how to feed millions, how to govern across cultures, how to turn raw power into lasting legitimacy. But it fell because it confused innovation with infallibility. The same roads that sped troops to rebellions also sped rebel messages. The trade networks that enriched the capital became vectors for dissent. Every solution bred new vulnerabilities, a lesson for an age where algorithms govern lives and data flows shape empires. The thread connecting Akkad to today isn't just about power, it's about the paradox of progress. Every breakthrough carries hidden costs. Every system designed for permanence sows the seeds of its own obsolescence. Modern leaders face the same tightrope walk: how to build structures sturdy enough to last but flexible enough to bend when the winds change. Akkad's ruins whisper that the answer lies not in resisting change but in expecting it, in designing not for the empire you have, but for the chaos you can't yet see. Akkad's legacy isn't locked in the past, it's a mirror reflecting the ambitions and vulnerabilities of modern superpowers. Just as Sargon's empire wielded trade routes like weapons, today's nations leverage economic sanctions, digital currencies, and supply chain dominance to bend others to their will. The parallels are uncanny. Akkad's standardized weights find their echo in global financial systems, where the dollar or euro's dominance shapes trade as decisively as bronze ingots once did. Even cultural influence follows ancient blueprints where Akkadian scribes rewrote local myths. Streaming platforms now flood the world with films and music that subtly promote a nation's values. But the game has changed in one crucial way: speed. Akkad's messengers took weeks to cross the empire. Today, a tweet or algorithm shift can ripple across continents in seconds. This acceleration reshapes the very nature of control. Ancient empires relied on physical infrastructure, roads, canals, fortresses, to project power. Modern powers build digital highways, fiber optic cables, satellite networks, and cloud servers that bind the world invisibly. When Akkad's canals silted up, its decline was slow. When a cyber attack knocks out a nation's power grid, collapse is instantaneous, yet some lessons transcend time. Akkad's overextension, trying to govern too much, too rigidly, haunts every hegemon. The Soviet Union's collapse under bureaucratic weight, America's struggles with endless foreign interventions, even the European Union's tension between unity and sovereignty, all replay Sargon's dilemma. The difference: modern empires lack Akkad's excuse of being first. They've got 4,000 years of cautionary tales to ignore. How we teach Akkad's story reveals as much about us as about the empire itself. In classrooms from Baghdad to Boston, it's often framed as a parable about hubris, a warning against overreach. But dig deeper and you'll find competing narratives. Some scholars emphasize Akkad's innovations, its legal codes inspiring Hammurabi, its trade networks foreshadowing globalization. Others focus on its victims, the countless unnamed souls crushed beneath imperial ambition. This tension between celebrating progress and mourning its costs makes Akkad a Rorschach test for our own anxieties about power. Textbooks aren't the only classrooms. Video games like Civilization let players relive Akkad's rise, making choices about conquest or diplomacy. Museums stage exhibits comparing its bureaucratic tablets to modern government databases. Even conspiracy theorists weave Akkad into wild tales of lost technologies, proving the empire's grip on our imagination. What all these interpretations share is a recognition: Akkad wasn't just a historical footnote. It was humanity's first attempt to answer a question we're still grappling with: how to organize societies at scale without losing sight of the people within them. The most striking shift in how we view Akkad comes from climate science. Once, its fall was blamed on barbarian invasions or administrative decay. Now, sediment cores and tree rings tell a grimmer story, a civilization undone by drought. This reframes the empire not as a cautionary tale about arrogance, but about adaptability. In an era of rising seas and supercharged storms, Akkad's struggle to engineer its way out of environmental collapse feels uncomfortably familiar. Its ruins whisper that no amount of bureaucratic brilliance can outwit nature's limits, a lesson we're relearning the hard way. Perhaps Akkad's greatest teaching is this: empires aren't machines but ecosystems. They thrive on balance between control and flexibility, growth and sustainability, power and consent. The scribes who recorded its triumphs and failures couldn't have imagined their words would echo into the digital age. Yet here we are, still deciphering their warnings, still repeating their mistakes, still searching for that elusive formula to make power endure without corrupting, to build without overreaching. The clay tablets may have crumbled, but the questions they pose are timeless. Teaching Akkad in classrooms often feels like walking a tightrope between inspiration and cautionary tale. At the elementary level, it's distilled into colorful maps and simplified narratives: Sargon the Conqueror, the world's first empire, a neat rise and fall arc. But by university seminars, those same events become a minefield of ethical debates. Should we admire Akkad's bureaucratic innovations or condemn its brutal deportations? Is it a story of human ingenuity or a warning about the costs of unchecked ambition? The way we frame these questions doesn't just teach history, it shapes how future generations perceive power itself. Take a typical high school textbook. Akkad might get a sidebar in a chapter on ancient civilizations, sandwiched between pyramids and ziggurats. The focus is usually on tangible achievements, standardized weights, the standing army, those iconic victory steals. What's often missing is the messy reality behind those innovations. For every efficient tax system, there were villages emptied to feed imperial ambitions. Every paved road that connected cities also sped armies to crush rebellions. Reducing Akkad to a list of firsts risks turning empire building into a bloodless chess game, divorcing progress from its human toll. College courses dig deeper, but even there, biases creep in. Political science classes might treat Akkad as a prototype for modern statecraft, analyzing its administrative hierarchy like a corporate org chart. Anthropology departments, meanwhile, often spotlight the displaced and disenfranchised, the Gutian herders pushed off ancestral lands, the Sumerian scribes forced to rewrite their histories. Both perspectives are valid, yet rarely do they intersect in ways that capture the full paradox of empire, its capacity to uplift and devastate simultaneously. The most provocative discussions emerge in ethics seminars. Imagine students grappling with a primary source like the Curse of Akkad tablet, where Naram Sin's sacrilege invites divine wrath. Is this ancient propaganda, climate change allegory, or something more profound? Debates ignite over whether Akkad's collapse was cosmic justice or the inevitable result of ecological mismanagement, an especially resonant question in an era of climate crisis. These conversations force uncomfortable parallels. When modern nations prioritize short-term growth over sustainability, are they repeating Naram Sin's mistakes? Yet classrooms aren't the only places wrestling with Akkad's legacy. Museums face their own dilemmas. Display a bronze spearhead from an Akkadian garrison, and do you label it as a military innovation or an instrument of oppression? Reconstruct a scribe's tablet detailing grain rations, and is it a testament to social welfare or a record of extraction? Even the act of preserving Akkadian artifacts raises questions. Many were excavated under colonial-era policies, their removal from Iraq now part of fraught restitution debates. What makes Akkad such a potent teaching tool isn't just its historical significance, but its refusal to fit neatly into moral boxes. It forces us to sit with discomfort, to recognize that the same systems that brought stability also enabled exploitation, that progress for some meant erasure for others. In an age where nations still weaponize history to justify present actions, teaching Akkad honestly becomes more than academic. It's a rehearsal for humility, a reminder that every empire, no matter how grand, is ultimately a human project, flawed, fragile, and freighted with consequences we're still learning to reckon with. Akkad's methods force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The tools that built history's first empire were often brutal. Mass deportations, psychological propaganda, systemic repression, these weren't side effects of Akkadian rule, they were its foundation. Take the case of Lagash, where records describe entire neighborhoods uprooted and resettled hundreds of miles away. On one hand, this tactic crushed resistance by scattering dissenters. On the other, it shattered families, erased cultural ties, and turned thriving communities into displaced fragments. Modern parallels from colonial resettlements to wartime population transfers show how this playbook persists, raising the same ethical dilemma. Does stability justify suffering? The propaganda machine was equally sophisticated. Victory steels didn't just record battles, they rewrote reality, depicting conquered rulers willingly bowing to Akkadian might. Scribes composed hymns calling Sargon, the shepherd of the black-headed people, framing oppression as paternal care. This wasn't just spin, it was psychological engineering, designed to make submission feel inevitable. Today, we see echoes in state-controlled media and algorithmic curation, where narratives shape perceptions as powerfully as any ancient chisel. Yet Akkad's defenders argue these methods work. For nearly 2 centuries, the empire maintained relative peace across Mesopotamia, suppressing the city-state wars that had previously ravaged the region. Trade flourished, infrastructure expanded, and arts thrived under imperial patronage. But at what cost? The very stability Akkad achieved relied on erasing alternatives, on making empire the only conceivable order. This tension between collective prosperity and individual autonomy still defines political ethics. When modern governments surveil citizens or manipulate information, they're wrestling with Sargon's original bargain, security versus freedom. Archaeologists face their own ethical quandaries when preserving Akkad's legacy. Many artifacts now in European museums were excavated under colonial policies that treated Mesopotamian sites as treasure troves rather than cultural heritage. Even the language we use to describe Akkad carries bias. Phrases like civilizing mission subtly justify its violence. Some scholars now advocate decolonizing Akkadian studies, centering voices from modern Iraq where the empire once stood. It's a reminder that how we remember power is itself an act of power. The most haunting question isn't whether Akkad's methods were effective, but whether they were worth their human toll. Its ruins offer no easy answers, only a mirror reflecting our own compromises. Every time we prioritize order over justice, efficiency over equity, we're replaying debates first etched into clay 4,000 years ago. Perhaps Akkad's true legacy isn't in its solutions, but in its insistence that we keep asking. The ancient cities of Akkad now face threats their builders never imagined. Looters scour archaeological sites under cover of darkness, smuggling cuneiform tablets and cylinder seals onto the black market. In conflict zones, bombs reduce millennia-old ziggurats to rubble, while unchecked urban sprawl swallows untold ruins beneath concrete. At Tel Brak, where archaeologists once uncovered Akkad's sprawling palace complex, satellite images now show looters' pits pockmarking the landscape like bullet wounds, each crater representing priceless context forever lost. Yet against these odds, a quiet army of conservators fights back. Teams from the University of Mosul risk danger to document damage, using 3D scanners to create digital twins of crumbling reliefs before they vanish. The Iraqi State Board of Antiquities trains former artifact smugglers as site guards, turning poachers into protectors. Even schoolchildren join efforts, collecting fragments of pottery and brick from plundered mounds, not for sale but for study. These battles over Akkad's remains aren't just about preserving relics, they're about defending humanity's origin story. Every looted tablet isn't merely a stolen object, it's a missing page from civilization's first playbook. When ISIS bulldozed Nimrud in 2015, they weren't just destroying statues, they were erasing the very blueprint of empire that shaped everything from Roman roads to modern bureaucracies. That's why projects like the Mosul Cultural Museum's restoration matter beyond academia. By painstakingly reassembling shattered Akkadian statues, conservators aren't gluing together broken stone, they're repairing the connective tissue between past and present. The challenges reveal uncomfortable truths about how we value history. A single Akkadian cylinder seal might fetch 6 figures at auction, yet the archaeologists preserving these sites struggle for funding. Climate change adds another layer of urgency. Rising salts from erratic rainfall eat away at mud brick walls, while droughts parch the very soil that's preserved artifacts for millennia. Some solutions come from unexpected places. Tech companies now partner with archaeologists, using AI to reconstruct fragmented tablets virtually, while gaming studios donate proceeds to digitize endangered artifacts. Even tourists play a role. Ethical heritage tours fund local guards, proving that preservation can be economically sustainable. What does Akkad's fragile legacy teach us about ambition? Perhaps that all empires, no matter how mighty, are temporary custodians of something greater than themselves. Sargon's engineers built canals to last eternity, yet today their remnants rely on plastic sandbags to survive another rainy season. The very systems Akkad invented to control its world now depend on our willingness to protect them. This inversion holds a profound lesson. Human achievement isn't measured by what we build, but by what we choose to remember. The same ingenuity that carved steels 4,000 years ago now fuels lasers mapping those same steels before sandstorms erase them forever. Akkad's story doesn't end in ruins, it continues in choices. When a farmer in southern Iraq reports looters instead of joining them, or when a student in Berlin studies Akkadian instead of corporate law, they become part of a chain stretching back to Sargon's scribes. The empire's true inheritance isn't just its administrative genius or military tactics, but the recognition that progress isn't linear. Every innovation carries a cost, every system has an expiration date, and the only permanence lies in our collective decision to keep learning from both. The Gutians couldn't erase Akkad's ideas, nor can time or greed, not as long as we keep listening to the whispers in the clay. Akkad's rise and fall isn't just a tale of ancient kings and crumbling walls. It's a reflection of humanity's oldest obsession, the hunger for control. We see it in the way Sargon didn't just conquer cities but rewrote their stories, in how his bureaucrats turned clay tablets into chains binding distant lands to a single will. That same impulse lives in us today. Whether it's governments tracking digital footprints or corporations algorithmically shaping desires, the playbook hasn't changed. Only the tools have. What's chilling is how familiar Akkad's contradictions feel. The empire promised stability, yet achieved it through systematic violence. It built roads to connect, but also to surveil, standardized weights to trade, but also to tax. Modern societies wrestle with the same trade-offs. Surveillance cameras reduce crime but erode privacy. Social media platforms unite people while breeding polarization. Like Akkad, we're forced to ask, how much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for the illusion of safety? Yet Akkad's story also warns of the dangers of overreach. Naram Sin's decision to declare himself a god wasn't just arrogance, it was a fatal misreading of power's limits. When leaders, ancient or modern, start believing their own propaganda, they grow deaf to dissent and blind to vulnerability. The climate crisis offers a stark parallel. Civilizations still chasing endless growth on a finite planet, repeating Akkad's mistake of engineering systems without accounting for nature's unpredictability. But here's the twist: Akkad's legacy isn't just a warning. It's proof that control is always a negotiation. The empire's most enduring innovations, standardized laws, cultural assimilation, economic interdependence, weren't just instruments of domination. They were messy, imperfect attempts to balance unity with diversity, to create shared rules without erasing local identities. Our modern struggles with globalization echo this tension. Can we build systems that connect without homogenizing, that govern without suffocating? Perhaps the most humbling lesson lies in Akkad's ruins. For all its military might and bureaucratic genius, the empire ultimately couldn't out-engineer human nature or environmental reality. Its subjects rebelled not just against oppression, but against the fragility of a system that left no room for adaptation. Today, as we face our own existential challenges, from AI governance to climate collapse, Akkad whispers a question: will we cling to control until it breaks us, or learn to build systems that bend instead of shatter? The answer isn't written in clay. It's being written now, in every choice between rigidity and resilience, between domination and cooperation. Akkad's story ends with dust, but ours doesn't have to. Akkad's empire stands as one of history's most breathtaking experiments in power, a civilization that didn't just conquer, but redefined what conquest could mean. Its fingerprints are everywhere in the modern world, from standardized laws to the psychological playbook of propaganda. Yet beneath its achievements lies a paradox. The very systems that made Akkad mighty also sowed the seeds of its destruction. Its story isn't just about ancient kings and clay tablets. It's a mirror held up to our own struggles with control, resilience, and the limits of ambition. Think about the empires that followed: Babylon, Rome, the British Empire. Each borrowed from Akkad's blueprint, refining its tactics but repeating its core dilemma: how to govern vast territories without stifling the diversity that fuels innovation. Today's superpowers face eerily similar challenges. When nations weaponize trade networks or tech giants monopolize data, they're replaying Akkad's gambit, engineering dependence to maintain control. The difference is, we have 4,000 years of hindsight to guide us, but Akkad's legacy isn't just a warning. It's proof that human ingenuity can reshape the world for better or worse. Those first bureaucrats chiseling tax records into clay were inventing governance itself. Their roads and canals weren't just infrastructure, they were the earliest attempts to knit distant cultures into something greater. In an age of fragmentation, that vision, flawed as it was, still holds a spark of promise. The empire's fall, though, carries the sharper lesson: no system, no matter how brilliantly designed, is immune to hubris. Akkad's rulers believed their control was eternal until droughts, rebellions, and inflexible bureaucracy proved otherwise. Today, as climate change redraws maps and algorithms rewrite social contracts, we're forced to ask: are we building systems that can adapt, or replicating Akkad's fatal rigidity? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The choices ahead between centralization and flexibility, growth and sustainability, are the same ones Akkad faced. Its ruins remind us that power isn't just about scale, it's about stewardship. The past isn't a dead artifact, it's a conversation. And as we navigate our own uncertain future, Akkad's triumphs and failures offer something rare, not a map but a compass. If this journey through history has sparked new questions or insights, let's keep the discussion alive. Share your thoughts below. What parallels do you see between Akkad's world and ours? And if you'd like to explore more forgotten chapters of human ambition, subscribe to join our next deep dive. After all, the stories we tell about the past are never just about then. They're about who we are now and who we might become.